Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And tonight I'm looking again at the work of David Coate, particularly The Great Fear, his history of the anti-communist purge under Truman and Eisenhower. And the thing that I want to talk about tonight, so it's an interesting aspect of what is a kind of a topic with many different strands to it. And that is the supposed culpability of the American Communist Party. At the time, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, it was widely believed or alleged that the American Communist Party, with its connections to Comintern, was involved in subversion and in espionage. Now, the argument that David Coate puts forward, and we're going to look at this in a moment, is that of course there was espionage. The Soviet Union, yes, of course, was spying on America, and it would be naive to assume that that wasn't happening. But the American Communist Party, there is no evidence whatsoever that the American Communist Party had any role in this. And anyone with even the sort of the smallest, most minuscule grasp of intelligence history would probably concur that the Soviet espionage didn't work in this way. The Soviet Union encouraged parties in non-communist countries to take whatever the Stalinist line was, and they encouraged within the Communist Party of America to ensure that party members stuck to the party line, and there were, reprisals and all sorts of kind of unpleasant activities carried out by party members against those that didn't, particularly those that were seen as kind of Trotskyite deviationists. But in terms of accessing state secrets, there was a very good reason why the Soviet Union didn't use satellite communist parties, or parties that were affiliated to Comintern, to do that. It's because they would have been incredibly easy to detect and to catch. The history of Soviet espionage and the functioning of Soviet espionage, the use of illegals and this kind of really quite out there intelligence stuff of things like essentially sleeper agents that did actually exist. That's the topic of a different podcast, or many different podcasts. Tonight we want to look at how the fear of espionage was weaponized against American communism. Okay, so we're going to dive into David Coate now. And I've just lost my page. Here we go. So he writes, "Spy fever flowed into the bloodstream of the nation from the twin needles of a single hypodermic, the Cold War and the backlash against the New Deal." The Republicans in the late 1940s realised that they had no meaningful economic offer to make to the American people. The New Deal and the massive state intervention years of the war years had shown the American populace that laissez-faire capitalism was not something that they could rely on, and the intervention of the state and the intervention of a Democrat-led state was electorally a far better bet, and the Republicans weaponized anti-communism and the questions of national security to imply that, as McCarthy would later put it, that from 1932 to 1952 had been a period, he called 20 years of treason, that somehow the United States had tacked too far to the left and had become unmoored from its essentially right-wing individualistic roots. But the New Deal was the thing that they were really seeking to destroy. The notion of the vital secret, the fantasy of the haves, whose nuclear monopoly was threatened, hypnotized congressmen, newspaper editors, and radio commentators. Despite the fact, familiar to all informed observers, that Washington is a vessel that leaks from the top, a cabinet discussion in 1945 about the merits of letting Russia share the secret of the A-bomb had been leaked within half an hour to a prominent journalist. The psychological imperative to equate radicalism with treason, with an anarchic alienation from the cradles of loyalty, soon brought about a most pathetic public gullibility to any tale of conspiracy. There is no documentation in the public record of a direct connection between the American Communist Party and espionage during the entire post-war period. Even during the Korean War, no evidence of communist sabotage or attempted sabotage came to light. The anti-Soviet, anti-communist historian Theodore Draper has written, "It would help in understanding the communist movement if the terms conspirator and conspiracy were reserved for actual Soviet agents. Except for a tiny minority, the communist membership has devoted its efforts to gaining mass influence with means that have been blatantly non-conspiratorial." So, the use of language here was significant. As Draper said, it would have been entirely proper to refer to actual Soviet agents as being involved in a conspiracy. But the way in which the Republican Party, and many Democrats too, because there were plenty of anti-communist Democrats, conservative commentators and liberal commentators as well. I did a podcast a while back on the kind of the democratic establishment's anti-communism. The way in which they talked about the Communist Party, this party that had only barely a legal and constitutional right to exist, as a kind of a conspirator against the United States of America. It presumes that there is one version of the United States of America that exists, a kind of liberal capitalist version, and that is the only legitimate one, and therefore any attempt to present an alternative set of beliefs, an alternative ideological picture, it isn't simply just a different a political challenge. It's not even political dissent. It is treason, and that again points to sort of deeper ideological assumptions about who is being conspired against, and which group sees themselves as being in charge in America. So David Coate writes, "One thing, however, must be made clear here. Those who deplore the anti-communist purge tend to dismiss all allegations of espionage as fabrications of the FBI. This would imply either that the Soviet Union did not attempt to suborn or succeed in suborning Americans, or that, if it did, the FBI never caught the guilty, only the innocent. Such assumptions are silly. They are not shared by the present writer. It is therefore a very real question whether Alger Hiss, the Rosenbergs, and others were in reality guilty or innocent of their crimes, of which they were accused and convicted. But it is a question which lies outside the proper province of this book and this podcast. There's already an abundant and contentious literature on the subject. Hiss and the Rosenbergs make their appearance here as elements in our portrait of the foreground, the front stage dramatics, which inevitably heightened tension throughout the country and greatly exacerbated the purge." So this is an important point, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. Of course the Soviets were spying. The Los Alamos spy ring, the extent of the guilt of the Rosenbergs is up for debate. Many historians have questioned how far either Ethel or Julius Rosenberg really knew what they were doing, or if one was more guilty than the other. And again, this is for a different kind of discussion. And even if they were guilty, the brutality of their execution stirred deep worry and fear and anxiety and anger in many parts of America, not simply just the liberal establishment. That being so, the way in which the case of the Rosenbergs and Alger Hiss and various others was weaponized and used wasn't designed necessarily to prevent espionage, Soviet espionage in America. It was designed to score broad political points by the Republicans and the right of the right-leaning Democrats in order to continue waging a Cold War, which was, in David Coates' view, in America's interests to wage, and also to destroy the organised left in America, which, particularly in the guise of the trade union movement, had become greatly empowered during the Depression years and the New Deal and the war years. On the 15th of February 1946, the Canadian government announced the arrest of 22 people charged with illegally passing information to the representatives of the Soviet Union. This followed the defection from the Soviet embassy in Ottawa of a cipher clerk, Igor Guzhenko, who brought with him incriminating files that conclusively proved the existence of an espionage ring staffed by trained personnel from the NKVD and military intelligence. Washington also noted proven links between the Canadian network and parallel ones in Britain and the United States, together with a demonstrable Soviet interest in devices relevant to post-war defense and communication systems of Western powers. Closer to home, writes David Coate, the Amaresia case kicked off the post-war espionage hunting season. Early in 1945, agents of the Office of Strategic Services raided the magazine Amaresia and turned up over 1,000 documents purloined from the State, War and Navy departments. Those involved included Philip Jaffe, the editor, Emmanuel Larson, a specialist in the China Division of the Bureau of Far Eastern Affairs, who was subsequently dismissed from the State Department, John Stuart Service, who was not, and Andrew Roth of Naval Intelligence. Although the Hearst and the Scripps Howard press built the affair up into a great spy sensation, it was much less than that. At his trial in September 1945, Jaffe was described even by the prosecutor as merely an overzealous editor. Larson turned up his coat and published a piece in September 1946 in the September 1946 issue of Plain Talk, a right-wing magazine, in which he complained that the State Department had been infiltrated by communists and accused Jaffe of having had dealings with Earl Browder, who was the head of the Communist Party of the USA, and the Soviet consulate. This was no doubt true. Jaffe, a Russian-born businessman, had been active in the communist circle since the 30s and had visited Mao in Yan'an. You might recall a podcast I did a while ago about Edgar Snow, the American journalist who first visited Mao in Yan'an in the 1930s and wrote the famous book Red Star Over China, all the time being part of being kind of carefully managed by Mao's minders, the whole affair being stage managed. But it made Yan'an a kind of a focal point for the American and European left and liberal intelligentsia, the kind of the fellow traveller movement, who went to see this kind of revolutionary figure who was, made immensely famous by Snow's book. not realising the extreme brutality that Mao in Yunnan inflicted on his own supporters, purging those who he viewed to be potential rivals. The Maoism and a Global History by Julia Lovell, of which I'm going to talk about a lot more on this podcast, is a great book and a great place to read about the Yunnan years. So yes, he visited Yunnan and Jaffé wrote for the magazine China Today under the name of J.W. Phillips, but neither he nor his sources had in mind to pass information to a foreign power. Each was committed to publicising the folly of American support for Chiang. Nevertheless, the incident revealed how quick-fingered, politically committed government servants could be, particularly the talented, idealistic, opinionated generation of young intellectuals who came to Washington under the New Deal. The question of China, which after 1949 would become incredibly vexed, was something that plagued the Washington establishment. It was abundantly clear by 1946-47 that all was not well in China, that the nationalist movement, the Kuomintang, was going to lose to Mao, that Mao's aid from Stalin and the fact that the Chinese nationalists were so openly corrupt, and the fact that the Chinese nationalists were seemingly incapable of offering rural China any sort of meaningful program that would improve their lot, meant that they were fighting a losing battle. They could beat the communists on the battlefield, although that was becoming more and more difficult as the communists were given plenty of leftover equipment from the Japanese that the Soviets had seized. But they couldn't win a battle for the, shall we say, the hearts and the minds of millions and millions of Chinese people. Mao was even able to present himself as a far more patriotic figure, seeking to undo a century of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers, and was able to strongly imply that the nationalists were in hock to Americans and Europeans and everybody else who had dragged China and dragged China down. So when the question of in 1949 arose as to who had lost China, the American State Department, the US State Department, came under heavy scrutiny from the Republicans, from the McCarthyites, who accused spies in the State Department of having passed secrets to either the Soviet Union or the Chinese. Much of this is complete fantasy, and in doing so, having created the loss of China. The idea, of course, cemented in certain minds in Washington that America had a China to lose, that China sort of belonged to America somehow. Well, America had a long-standing ambitions towards China, seeing it as a huge market for American goods, and possibly a kind of a country which could be educated by America in the ways of achieving liberal democracy. So the loss of China and the gradual increase of anxieties over potentially losing China are something that is very much in not necessarily in the public mind, but in the minds of those looking to weaponize anti-communism during the period. General George Marshall, then Truman's Secretary of State, went to China and concluded that the war was unlikely to be won, and it was the view of the likes of Marshall and a great many liberal commentators that this was probably the case, and it was better that America cut its losses. Now, the next time that I focus on this topic, I'm going to be talking about the former Soviet agent Whittaker Chambers. But he's worthy of mention now because Chambers was the kind of the chief informant of the era. He is the person who is the kind of the major source of accusations against Alger Hiss. David Cope writes about him. Chambers, who described himself as a communist and a Soviet agent until early 1938, claimed that at least 75 government officials had been involved in varying degrees of pro-Soviet espionage in the late 1930s. Elizabeth Bentley, who was a famous author of the book Out of Bondage, like Chambers, a graduate of Columbia, had joined the Communist Party in 1935 and, so she said, had been ordered to go underground 3 years later. Jacob Golos, head of World Tourists, a member of the Communist Party and reputedly an agent of the Soviet GPU, became her contact and lover until his death in 1943. She continued with her espionage work until August 1945, and when she made contact with the FBI, at whose request she maintained her contacts with the Communist Party underground until 1947, when she finally broke cover by testifying before a federal grand jury in New York. On that time, the grand jury indicted 12 communist leaders under the Anti-Communist Smith Act, and subpoenaed scores of past and present government employees accused of belonging to the Communist Party or to communist espionage rings. So the testimony of people like Bentley and Whittaker, who were the star witnesses for the FBI, had a huge impact. And the implication here is that these claims were highly unreliable, and largely because much of the many of the assertions that the Communist Party of the USA was actively involved in the type of espionage that Whittaker Chambers and Elizabeth Bentley claimed was happening couldn't have been true. There's no documentary evidence of it, and also it's just not how Soviet espionage worked. Soviet spies, the KGB was had the most sophisticated spying apparatus in the world, and they just didn't rely on people in this way. They were far more organized in their intelligence gathering than that. Okay, so let's finish there. Thanks very much for listening. Do check out the Explaining History website, explaininghistory.org, and go and find us at the Explaining History Facebook group. There's always something interesting going on there. And if you're able to help subsidize and fund and help the podcast in any way, do find us on Patreon too, and you can find a link on the Explaining History website. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye-bye.